Hello and welcome back. This is the Week 7 lecture. So today we're talking about My Own Private Idaho, written and directed by Gus Van Sant. And Van Sant has the distinction of being the only filmmaker who we are studying twice this semester. We are watching two of his films. Obviously this one, and then in week 13, I believe, it's our second to last film, we watch Good Will Hunting, which is the film that he's perhaps still best known for. But this is a film that helps to really launch his career as a mainstream filmmaker. So we'll obviously dive into the subject matter and the film itself, but first I want to say a few things about how the film got made, and let's also keep in mind that Van Sant is the writer and the director of this particular film, much like we saw last week with Spike Lee when he wrote and directed Do the Right Thing. So I do want to talk a little bit about the screenplay that we see sort of play out in this particular film. There's some really interesting aspects to the writing. I think we can make some very clear literary connections. We can talk about the Shakespearean influence at work here. But also Van Sant is working with a lot of elements that we would associate with realism. He's drawing on some aspects of street life in the Pacific Northwest that he himself had observed. He had gotten to know some people, sort of street hustlers, people who are sort of similar or existed in a similar milieu to the one we see in the film. Van Sant was a photographer, so he had a background doing some art in these places with some of these types of characters in the past. And he's also working from the autobiographies of some other some other writers and some other pre-existing work. So there's kind of a large body of almost like documentary sources that Van Sant is drawing on here. But then there's also some flights of fancy, a real Shakespearean and sort of literary influence that's a little bit different and takes us into a slightly less realistic domain. So it's an interesting mixture in that regard. So we can talk about the screenplay in addition to talking about some of the visual elements of the film. The film might be best remembered today for its cast, primarily the two leads, Keanu Reeves and River Phoenix. Reeves, of course, continues to be a big movie star. This was a film that if you read a lot of critics or if you read a lot of sort of critical assessments of the film, this helped to sort of, create a different perception for Reeves, who had first come to attention largely through the Bill and Ted movies. And, I think we sort of know a little bit about his career trajectory by this point because he remains a very popular actor and arguably has had kind of a renaissance, I would say, in recent years with the John Wick films and some other sort of critically acclaimed and popular films. I think he's viewed pretty favorably now. He used to be kind of regarded as a little bit more of a limited actor who was primarily sort of good at playing goofball, sort of comic characters. And this film, according to many, helped to change that perception, or it began to change that perception, sort of showed off a little bit more range on the part of the actor and showed that he was capable of playing different kinds of roles, different kinds of characters. Interesting to point out that the film Speed, I think, comes out maybe 4 or 5 years after this one, and that really sort of establishes Reeves as like a big blockbuster sort of box office draw. That was a hugely successful action film. So he, like Van Sant and like the company that produced and distributed this movie, he goes from being sort of an indie darling to a big part of the sort of mainstream Hollywood filmmaking apparatus. So we can track that trajectory in a couple of different ways as we're talking about this film. And we can also discuss River Phoenix, who plays Mikey. You might know a little bit about his own personal story, the younger brother of... Well, actually, I think he was the older brother. Yeah, the older brother of Joaquin Phoenix, who's a well-known actor today. River Phoenix was a rising star in the early 90s, died very young, tragically, of a drug overdose. So this was one of his, this is one of his best remembered roles. And there's sort of this tragic element to his personal story that I think often kind of bleeds into how people read the film. Because of his character, and I think of certain associations we have between the character and the actor, and the fact that the actor died at a very young age. And I think, yeah, again, in the early 90s, maybe in 93, is when River Phoenix died. I'd have to double check that, but not long after this film debuts. So the film comes out in 1991, and it was produced by Fine Line Features. And I want to talk a little bit about Fine Line and the larger company to which it belonged, which was known as New Line Cinema. So again, this is an illustration of a trend that I've been talking about at times earlier in the semester, how we see a lot of independent studios springing up, kind of starting in the 70s, and then that's a process that really accelerates throughout the 1980s. We talked about this a little bit with Miramax a couple of weeks ago. These are often studios that start out on kind of a small scale. They are independent, meaning they are outside the Hollywood system. And like we saw with Miramax, they started out as a distribution company, mostly working with concert films. And then they get involved in home video, acquiring home video rights to various films. Then, due to some success there, they get into the production side of filmmaking. They have some successful films. They get bigger. They get a bigger profile. And then eventually they get purchased, Miramax does, in 93 by Disney. So for many, at that point, Miramax ceases to be independent. But even as they are owned by this much larger, media corporation, Miramax continues to operate sort of autonomously, and they keep on, at least for a while, making the same kinds of movies, the same kinds of art house, independent, or at least independent sort of in style and tone, that they were making years earlier. So we see a very similar trajectory here with New Line Cinema. So New Line was a studio originally founded in 1967 in New York City. And like Miramax, it started life as strictly a distribution company. And its whole sort of niche, the whole, point of the company was to really specialize in what we call sort of art house films, or a lot of foreign films that would often play on college campuses. So they were really sort of focused on a young, educated crowd, a lot of college students in that sort of northeast corridor. And that's how the company started. A very small niche, sort of underground, arty, often foreign films that would play for very specific types of audiences on the East Coast. So an independent company. Then in the 70s, they get involved in production. So we often see this. A company starts out just doing distribution or maybe just doing production, and then they start adding other things as they get more successful. So New Line gets involved in production starting in the 70s, and that's really when they become truly a standalone studio, a production studio that also handles distribution. So again, they're very much independent at that stage. And then in the 80s, they sort of make it big. New Line makes it big with the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, the Freddy Krueger movies, as they're often thought of. So that those make it big, throughout the 80s, and that helps to put the studio on the map. It brings in a lot of revenue. So with this newfound success, they're able to continue to sort of expand and diversify. So in 1990, what they do is they create what's called sort of the art house division, or the art house arm of the larger studio. Because remember that the roots of New Line was very much, tied to, what we would consider sort of arty films, the kind of stuff that Pearson would have been seeing in those repertory theaters in New York City back in the 70s. So they always had an interest in those kind of movies. But as New Line got bigger, they needed a smaller branch to really focus on the more indie style movies, while New Line started to make, bigger, sort of more mainstream films. And this is often what we see throughout the 80s. A lot of studios, independent studios and long-running traditional Hollywood studios start doing this. Pearson discusses it in the book. They start to create these art house divisions, these arms, these branches that focus on what were often called sort of niche movies, arty films that maybe wouldn't find a huge audience, but they would appeal to somewhat narrow or specialized audiences. Again, maybe college students at elite, liberal arts colleges, people in big cities who were cinephiles and liked European sort of art cinema, right? There were markets for these kinds of movies who weren't going to make a ton of money, but for a successful studio like New Line, it made sense to have an art house division that could really focus on those kinds of indie films. So that's what Fine Line Features was. Created in 1990, it became the art house division for New Line Cinema. And Fine Line was able to kind of make a name for itself as this smaller entity in the early 90s by making a couple of successful films. The first one coming in 92, both of these films directed by Robert Altman, who's kind of an important name in American cinematic history. We're not dealing with him in this class, but he was very popular in the 60s and 70s. He made the original MASH, the feature-length film that the TV series was later based on. He did some other big movies, but he was kind of notoriously difficult, like a lot of auteur-style filmmakers, and sort of fell out of favor and really didn't work very much throughout the 80s. So he has this kind of career renaissance in the early 90s, largely on the strength of these two films that get produced through Fine Line. First, The Player in 1992, which is kind of a Hollywood satire, I guess, about like this sort of this agent. And then the following year, 1993, Shortcuts, which is another hit, both directed by Robert Altman. They helped to reestablish his career, and they earned money, credibility, and attention for Fine Line Features. So things are going well, both for New Line, the big parent company, and Fine Line, that art house division. And it's Fine Line that ultimately puts the money towards the production of this film. So Van Sant had a script, and he was shopping it around. Eventually, he found financing through Fine Line, so they handled the production and I believe the distribution of the film as well. But a big change comes soon when we're talking about New Line and their trajectory as an independent studio. So I believe it's in 1993, right around the same time that Miramax is being bought by Disney, New Line Cinema is purchased by the Turner Broadcasting System. So you guys might be familiar with Ted Turner, multi-millionaire, sort of, businessman, media magnate. He used to own the Atlanta Braves. Maybe he still does. I don't know. He was based in Atlanta. I think he's still alive. Maybe not. He was married to Jane Fonda, who's, famous actress from the 70s. I guess she still acts, not as much. But anyway, Turner owned CNN, TBS, popular TV network that I think still exists. So he had this huge media empire, and ultimately Turner buys New Line. And that includes Fine Line as well, of course, buys all of it, buys the entire studio, just like Disney buys Miramax. So this is happening a lot in the early 90s. These independent studios are sort of getting gobbled up. They're getting consumed or subsumed by these larger media corporations. So that's what happens here. I believe the price tag was $500 million. That's what it cost Turner Broadcasting System to acquire New Line Cinema. But they do it, and New Line becomes a part of the Turner empire. But just like we saw with Miramax and Disney, New Line is allowed to sort of continue to operate like an autonomous entity. much like Miramax does. But we'll also note, unlike Miramax, who at least initially continued to make a lot of the same kinds of films that they were making before their acquisition by Disney, New Line really sort of just goes mainstream throughout the 90s. They end up producing and distributing a lot of really big movies in that decade. They get into the Jim Carrey business back when that was a very lucrative business. They did The Mask, they did Dumb and Dumber. They distributed Hoop Dreams in 1994, not featuring Jim Carrey. We are going to be watching that film later in the semester. So Hoop Dreams got made independently, but then New Line bought it and distributed it. So they bought it after it had already been made. So they just handled distribution for Hoop Dreams, but they also produced and distributed the movie Seven. Some of you might have seen that, a big hit from the mid-90s. Brad Pitt, Morgan Freeman, Gwyneth Paltrow, directed by David Fincher. They did the original Friday movie with Ice Cube and Chris Tucker. They did Boogie Nights. They did the Austin Powers movies beginning in the late 90s. And then in the early 2000s, they produced the Lord of the Rings series. So you've made it to the big time when you're doing Lord of the Rings. So New Line goes from this indie company, initially a distribution company in New York, then they become a fully independent studio by the 70s, and then they get bought by TBS in the early 90s, and they become a pretty mainstream, pretty popular studio, churning out big box office successes. But like a lot of other studios, they continue to have a little art house division that can specialize in those artier, more niche movies. So that's how My Own Private Idaho would probably be described, kind of a niche film. It was, not hugely successful at the box office. Some people call it a little bit of a cult film, like a lot of other films that might be a little bit offbeat or strange. To many audiences, they often find a following after their theatrical run, in part due to home video. Now that we are in the 90s, of course, we can continue to notice that home video is a real force, and it's a real sort of equalizer in some ways, where it just gives more people access to films that they probably wouldn't have been able to see. People who live in the suburbs or maybe more, small town settings, they're going to have opportunities maybe to rent films that would have never played theatrically near them. So again, we've talked about how that helped some indie films throughout the late 80s and certainly all through the 90s as home video continues to get bigger and bigger. So just to finish the story about the studio, in 96, I believe all of Turner's stuff, his whole media empire, ends up getting bought by Time Warner. So ultimately, the corporate overlord, the corporate master of New Line Cinema changes, but business for New Line doesn't really change. They continue to churn out very popular films. So let's shift gears now and talk a little bit about Gus Van Sant, our writer-director. Again, the only filmmaker we're going to check out twice. So that's quite an honor. I didn't do that strictly because of him. I just thought both films really worked well in our syllabus. But he is obviously a very accomplished American filmmaker, and he continues to make films today. He first broke through in 1986 with the film Mala Noche, which was based on an autobiography written by this guy named Walt Curtis, who's a well-known sort of Portland personality. And some of you might have been able to notice sort of by the scenery that we are largely in Portland, I believe, in this particular film. We're in the Pacific Northwest. Some reviewers mention Portland and Seattle as being settings that are utilized here, but we're very much in a Pacific Northwest geographical region. And a lot of what Van Sant was drawing on here was based on his own experiences living in Portland, Oregon, also interviewing street hustlers who live there, and also his familiarity with Walt Curtis. And so Mala Noche was a film based on the book, an autobiography written by Curtis, who himself was sort of a a street hustler, somebody who sort of lived an alternative lifestyle for the time period and wrote extensively about it. Really wrote a lot about sort of just like street culture and a lot of the hustlers and sort of, people that he came into contact with or lived with, worked with. Many of them were, worked as prostitutes, often gay prostitutes. Not all of them necessarily identified as gay, but there's a lot of exploration of gender identities and sexuality, and also street life. So the movie is very much, that first movie for Van Sant is based on the autobiography. I believe Curtis is also a character in the film. So it's very much taken from this sort of documented previous work on that particular milieu. And then a couple of years later, 1989, Van Sant comes out with Drugstore Cowboy, and that really kind of puts him on the map. That finds him a much wider audience. That was a popular film starring Matt Dillon and Kelly Lynch, and it found a pretty big audience. Again, sort of depicting marginalized characters sort of existing off the beaten path, well outside of, the boundaries of sort of respectable society. But the film was a little bit more mainstream in that it sort of foregrounded a heterosexual romance, found a wider audience, was a little bit more, fit in a little bit more to some popular and sort of mainstream movie making conventions of the time. So that got Van Sant a little bit more attention. And then, like I said, he had a script here from My Own Private Idaho. He was shopping it around. Eventually, New Line provides financing for the production of the film. And this film is often considered a landmark in what's known as the new queer cinema of the early 90s. So we got into talking a little bit about this when we were discussing Parting Glances back in week 2. But in the early 90s, you have a real proliferation of films depicting gay characters. All kinds of different gay characters in different settings doing different things. But the commonality is that we were having more and more sort of frank, accurate depictions of gay life, gay characters. Something that we did not see very much prior to the 80s. So we were talking about this in relation to Parting Glances, how part of what made that film noteworthy and a little bit revolutionary when it came out in 86 is it was just frankly portraying the lives of gay men in New York City and was doing it in a way that really foregrounded what we might call their normalcy. They were just living very recognizable lives, navigating relationships, work. Of course, the specter of AIDS hung over the entire film. We talked about that. That gives it a different dimension, but we also noticed that these are very recognizable characters. And that might seem pretty banal or commonplace to us now, but again, we were talking about how it was still relatively rare to see a film like that in the 80s, because previously, particularly if we're talking about mainstream Hollywood films, if we did see gay characters, they would often be caricatures. They would often be rendered in ways that had a lot more to do with heterosexual viewers or preferences or stereotypes than they did with anything approaching the reality of those lived experiences. So we're starting to see that change. As the 80s progress, I mentioned back in week 2, there were some other pretty big landmark films depicting gay characters that came out at around the same time as Parting Glances. So we were beginning to see a little bit of a shift as the 80s progressed. And now, as we move into the early 90s, we actually have a movement, or something that has been labeled now as by film historians and cultural critics as a real movement. A number of different films that were doing a lot more to give gay characters and gay life sort of equal representation, compared to what it had been. So there were a lot of other important films. We're not watching any of them, but just to give you a little bit more context, all of this is happening in the early 90s. So a film like Poison, which came out in 91, directed by Todd Haynes, who continues to be pretty important filmmaker in America. Isaac Julian's Young Soul Rebels also comes out in 91. Derek Jarman, an English director, Also in 91 does Edward III, which reminds me a little bit of some of what we see in this particular film. That's a film, Edward III, that's based on a play by Christopher Marlowe. And as we're going to see here, we have a lot of borrowing from a Shakespeare play. So not Marlowe, but Shakespeare and Marlowe were sort of contemporaries. Also, around that same time, I believe in 92, we have The Living End, directed by Greg Araki, which is another sort of big landmark film in the movement. In 94, we have Go Fish, directed by Rose Trochet, which sort of depicts urban lesbian life in a way that hadn't always been seen very much on screen. So these were all sort of honest, unapologetic depictions of gay life that were much more accurate, and they were often written or directed or both by gay filmmakers. So just a higher level of authenticity than what we had previously seen on the rare occasions when there would have been any representation for LGBTQ characters or experiences. So we can read this as progress, or we can read this perhaps as the filmmaking industry opening up a little bit, and there's now more opportunities for different people to express themselves and sort of have their voices heard, becoming a little bit easier, though certainly not easy, for non-white, non-straight, non-male directors to get their projects made. Still an uphill struggle for many, but we do see things beginning to change. But the kinds of lifestyles and the kind of milieu that we see here in this particular film are obviously very different from what we saw in Parting Glances. You know, in Parting Glances, we saw very upwardly mobile, affluent lifestyles. Characters who seem to be very successful, at least financially and sort of, professionally, and by and large they seem pretty comfortable with their identities and their sort of places in the world, which again was kind of novel, presenting LGBTQ characters like that. But here we have a very different time, a different place, and different characters. We have gay street hustlers, primarily in these sort of gritty urban spaces of the Pacific Northwest. Again, we see maybe a little bit of urban decay, a little bit of that gray, gritty quality that we might remember from Stranger Than Paradise. It might put us a little bit in mind of Roger and Me. We've actually seen it multiple times already this semester. We might see it a little bit more here. So we have a different physical location, a different geographical location, and we have characters who exist in a very different social class by and large. And, their lives obviously look very different. So we might view different, compared to what we saw back in week 2. So we might view Scott and Mike as pretty prototypically disaffected, alienated youth, somewhat marginalized, not wanting to conform to sort of conventional society. We've all met characters like these before. We've seen them in literature and film. We might think of them as being a little bit updated here to a sort of grungy early 90s milieu. You might think a little bit about the grunge movement just kind of in a larger sense. I don't know if it shows up here directly in a lot of ways. Maybe a little bit with the rock promoters and even just some of the outfits, some of the clothes and fashion that we see. But most of us kind of recognize grunge primarily as like a musical movement in the early 90s. It did come out of the Pacific Northwest, bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam. Most of us are at least somewhat familiar with this, even if it's not our preferred, style of music. But this was a big cultural force, in the early 90s. The music, sure, but I do think it was a little bit more than just a group of bands that, also included popular rock bands like Alice in Chains, Soundgarden. A lot of bands that went on to big critical and commercial success, like Pearl Jam. Lasted a lot longer, of course, than Nirvana. But in addition to the music, there was also kind of an aesthetic, like a visual aesthetic, a lot of flannel and jeans, and very casual look, sort of scruffy not really interested in like mainstream commercial success. Again, very indie. There was a real do-it-yourself kind of vibe, at least in the early days of the grunge movement. So it often sort of bled into, I think, fashion, and there were even some movies that really tried to depict that particular era and style. If you familiar with Cameron Crowe, I mean, he later got famous with Almost Famous or like Jerry Maguire, stuff that he did later in his career. But earlier in his career, a film like Singles, which came out, I think, in 91, starring Matt Dillon, who was also in Drugstore Cowboy, very much about the grunge scene in the Pacific Northwest. Musicians like Eddie Vedder and Chris Cornell had cameos in that film. And again, Crowe was very much trying to document it was sort of just like a cultural movement, and it affected music, fashion, film, and it was just sort of this disaffected, kind of alienated attitude often associated with Generation X. You guys are probably familiar with a lot of that. So we are kind of getting a little bit of that style, maybe a little bit of that fashion here in the film, although we're not dealing directly with the music or some of those other themes that often get lumped in with grunge. But again, we're kind of in that milieu, and we might view these characters as maybe somewhat similar to kind of, at least their attitudes towards the mainstream world might be a little bit similar to what we associate with kind of, indie alternative rock music, if that's something that we're at all interested in. So that is an influence, I think. And then also we have another sort of basis, another book serving as a basis for some of what we see in the film. A lot of this is loosely based on a novel written in 1963 by John Ritchie entitled City of Night. And City of Night was just sort of another one of these unsparing looks at gay hustlers and street life in several different West Coast cities. I think he's in LA, but also the Pacific Northwest, maybe the Bay Area as well. And one thing that Ritchie kind of catalogs or discusses in the book is the sort of complex sexual and gender identities that were often on display amongst these street hustlers. A lot of these were young people who had been made homeless through various means. Perhaps they had been rejected by their family, or they just didn't have a stable family life. They were able to find some sense of community out on the streets. A lot of them, again, sort of worked as prostitutes. A lot of them worked as, gay prostitutes, but didn't necessarily identify as being gay, or they wouldn't admit to having that identity. So that was something that, gets explored in the book. And again, we also have Walt Curtis. He's a big influence. He was this prominent, chronicler of Portland street life. And Van Sant's first film was based on Curtis's autobiography. So a lot of different influences that Van Sant does draw from here. And he also had some personal experience with Portland. He was not originally from there. I think his dad was like a traveling salesman or something. So he moved around a lot as a kid. But he went to high school in Portland, and then he later returned as an adult, I believe in the 80s. He moved back to Portland, started doing some photography, and he got really interested in street life there and started to kind of document it. So there is a lot of realism at work in the film. And we can also see a little bit of that photography influence, that background that Van Sant had in the way that he frames some of his shots, some of the scenery, but we also get some sort of absurdist, slightly surreal touches that can sometimes be a little bit jarring in terms of like tone. Like that one moment where we see Scott and Mike appearing on the cover of like Beefcake magazines, and then they start to speak. So these kind of surrealistic moments get inserted in the midst of what otherwise I think often seems to be a pretty realistic portrait of this particular sort of slice of life. But we do see some really nice framing, some nicely staged shots. We see elaborately staged poses of nude bodies during that magazine sequence. So we can see a little bit of Van Sant's kind of artistic background as a photographer, somebody who's very interested in the presentation of human bodies. but also he's drawing on a lot of realism, a lot of documentary sources when it comes to the actual subject matter of the film. So, there's comedy here. There's kind of a, it's sort of a buddy movie to a certain extent with Scott and Mike and their relationship. But what's always struck me about the film is it really changes a lot. It's a little bit of a shapeshifter. So if we break it down into different parts or maybe different acts, I think we could see the first act, the second act, and the third act as all being pretty different in terms of tone, style, and maybe even in terms of location, setting, and other elements as well. So if we look at the second section, the kind of middle section of the film, we're going to notice a really heavy Shakespearean influence that doesn't necessarily show up, certainly not in the same way, not as noticeably in any other parts of the film. But in that middle part, we have a lot of Shakespearean paraphrases. We even have some direct quotations and even a lot of the plot points, not just dialogue, but a lot of the plot points, a lot of what's actually happening in the film comes directly from Henry IV, parts 1 and 2. So some of you might be familiar with that play written by Shakespeare. It's one of his histories. So it's the story of a real-life English king, but obviously Shakespeare is fictionalizing a lot of the elements and making it into a great story. But it's divided up into part 1 and part 2. And a lot of the material that we see in that middle section comes directly from Henry IV. And in fact, Scott increasingly starts to fill the role of Prince Hal, later to become the king. And some of you might be familiar with this story. It gets adapted a lot. So Van Sant and this film, they're not the first, and they certainly won't be the last. The story has real resonance because Prince Hal, when he's young, he hangs out with a bunch of disreputable sort of good time buddies led by this sort of large, sort of rotund, very outspoken, kind of outlandish character named Falstaff. And Falstaff is kind of the ringleader of this merry band of pranksters. They get into a lot of misadventures. They're kind of thieves. They steal. They get into all kinds of hijinks. They drink a lot. They're often having fun and sort of reveling. And Prince Hal, hangs out with them and has fun with them and really regards them as friends. It kind of scandalizes the royal family. It's often looked down upon, but he enjoys himself. And then as he gets older, as he ascends to the throne and becomes king, he ultimately turns his back on the merry pranksters and Falstaff, and he refuses to associate with them. I think he ultimately gets Falstaff thrown in prison, if I'm remembering the end of the play. But he famously turns his back on Falstaff, and there's a famous scene that gets reenacted at the end of the film where Falstaff tries to approach the now king and sort of, tries to remind him, hey, God bless you, it's me, it's your old buddy. And instead of being happy to see him, the king says, I know you not. I don't know you, old man. Leave me alone. And we see that scene play out at the end of the film. So there's a real heavy amount of borrowing going on, not only in the middle section, but it's largely there. So yeah, we see that scene at the end. It's very much paraphrased at the end. They're not using a lot of Shakespeare's language in that final scene. But in this middle section of the film, I marked it as starting roughly around the 27-minute mark, where we first meet the character of Bob. So Bob is filling the Falstaff role, and really beginning at around the 27-minute mark and extending up until about the 46-minute mark, that entire section of the film is almost directly pulled from Henry IV. That whole robbery scheme that they come up with is directly pulled from the plot of Henry IV. Most of what we see in the film plays out, I believe, in Act 2 of Henry IV. I believe in part 1. Now I'm getting my numbers mixed up. Act 2, Scene 5 of Part 1. Yeah, of Henry IV. So the whole robbery scheme and much of the dialogue that comes directly after it is basically lifted in some cases verbatim from Shakespeare's play. Now, in other cases, Van Sant, as the screenwriter, remember he's the writer and director, at times he paraphrases. He summarizes, might be a more accurate way of putting it, because he'll condense. He'll borrow a couple of different lines from different places and kind of collapse them together to create, a little bit more expediency, to kind of be a little more efficient. And then at other times, it's interesting to observe, he just kind of uses vaguely Shakespearean language. He's not always directly quoting or paraphrasing or summarizing from the play. Sometimes he's just using kind of a Shakespearean cadence or some vaguely Shakespearean words. So it just kind of sounds a little bit like the play, even though some of it appears to have just been written originally by Van Sant. But he's borrowing a little bit of Shakespeare's style, a little bit of Shakespeare's syntax and word choice to just kind of create a really sort of a different feeling. To me, we have a different sort of stylistic approach in this second part, in this sort of middle section of the film. So again, it lasts for about 19 minutes or so. So if you want to revisit the film, I would recommend starting at around the 27-minute mark, where we first meet Bob. He's apparently been in Boise, and now he's come back to Portland. And, he's obviously friends with Scott and Mike. They have a pre-existing relationship. And a lot of these other kind of street youths who sort of congregate and hang out together and do various hustles and schemes together, a lot of them seem to be squatting in this one old house. Bob shows up. There's kind of, it's kind of a merry scene. They end up plotting this robbery. And in the midst of the robbery, Scott and Mike sort of play a prank on Bob and some of Bob's followers. And again, that's directly taken from the play. That's what Prince Hal does to Falstaff in Henry IV. They set up this robbery scheme, but then Hal basically steals the money that they've stolen from Falstaff, and then later reveals the whole thing is supposed to be kind of comic and fun. And they're just sort of, rascals, they're just sort of getting into trouble, having fun, but also being somewhat disreputable. And that's, of course, the ultimate sort of reversal or change that we see in the play. When Prince Hal ascends to the throne, he has to do away with childish things. He has to do away with his good time buddies and their disreputable natures, because he has to become respectable as he takes on more responsibility. So we see that play out in the film, right? Once Scott inherits the family money, his father dies, he leaves the street life behind. Now, he's already told Bob previously that he's planning to do that, but we see it by the end of the film. He really seems to almost become a different person, well-dressed, polished, and ready to become some kind of, politician or man of industry, and he turns his back on Bob, just as he turns his back on his previous life. So it is kind of interesting just to observe some of that. I don't know how interested you guys are, but if you do go to part 1 of Henry IV, Act 2, Scene 5, you'll notice a lot of the material that you can see in those sequences in the old house, like with like the sort of squatting encampment, especially post-robbery. As Scott and Mike are sort of poking fun at Bob and really egging him on, encouraging him to tell lies about what actually happened, exaggerating the number of people that they encountered and stole the money from them. So again, it's just a lot of Shakespearean language, but also we see we see a sort of active, dynamic camera and almost a sort of stage-like staging during this particular part of the film when they're sort of using the Shakespearean language, and we have the back and forth between mostly Scott and Bob. Again, a lot of that just sort of puts us in mind of Shakespeare, and even just the way that it's filmed, I think, makes us think a little bit of maybe being on stage in more of a classic theatrical situation. So again, you can find a few specific lines like when they're getting Bob to explain what had happened, and he keeps increasing the number of ruffians that they ran into, and they're sort of gently not so gently poking fun at him. What, 4? I thought you said 2. 4. I told you 4. A lot of these lines, again, they might get changed a little bit. Some of the language gets modernized a little bit, gets updated. But a lot of it is largely lifted from the play. At one point, Scott says, thank God you had not murdered some of them. And then Falstaff, or in this case Bob, goes on and says, no, some are past praying for. I have peppered 2 of them. I am sure that I have. 2 rogues in buckram suits. That's the original language in the play. In the movie, they change it from 2 rogues in buckram suits to 2 punks in leather jackets. So it's kind of fun to observe the way Van Sant both borrows Shakespeare's language, but then also kind of revises it. At times he updates it. At other times he quotes it verbatim. So just there, just in that one example, he uses some of the language directly. They're past praying for. I have peppered 2 of them. Peppered is an old, Elizabethan slang for meaning you made it hot for them. You made it sort of dicey or difficult for them. So he says, I have peppered 2 of them. We hear Bob say that. But then a little bit other parts of the language get updated. So instead of 2 rogues in buckram suits, it's 2 punks in leather jackets. But the ultimate meaning, the ultimate sort of comic value remains the same. So there's about a 2-page stretch within the play that get, at least in my edition here, I have this sort of scholarly edition of Shakespeare's histories. It's about 2 pages of text that Van Sant is largely working with. And he's drawing a lot of the language from here. It kind of ends once they finally reveal that they have the money, that they were the ones that took it from Bob. We end with this line, which pretty much is quoted directly from Shakespeare. But by the Lords, lads, I am glad you have the money. And we hear Bob say that. I am glad you have the money. So that's pretty much where the really heavy borrowing ends. But then we have that final scene. Not the very final scene, but the final scene between Bob and Scotty at the restaurant. So again, Scott by this point has ascended to this higher position. He's well dressed. He has his, girlfriend, fiance, soon to be wife. He's entering into this totally new walk of life. And he brutally sort of rejects Bob. And I just thought we could read this, the original, because for some reason Van Sant doesn't quote very much directly. I'm just a little curious by the choice. He borrows more liberally earlier in the film in that middle section that I was just talking about. Here, it's really just a summary. He's really just sort of capturing the basic ideas expressed by Prince Hal, or the King now, or of course Scotty in the film. Just sort of a gloss, a sort of overview of the main ideas being expressed, but we don't get much of the language. So I thought we could just read it in its original form, and again, we can see how this has a strong bearing on what we see in the film. What we see here, what we hear from the King, from Prince Hal, now he's known as King Harry, a lot of this also represents Scott, and it represents his character arc that we watch in the film. So again, in the play, there's some kind of like royal procession, and the newly crowned king is like walking with his retinue, his entourage, and all these people are lining the streets to get a look at him. And Falstaff is there along with a couple of his cronies, his old associates, and he's trying to get the attention of the king. And again, we hear this, I think, in the film. God save you, my sweet boy. We hear Bob say that. That's what Falstaff says in the text. They make one change. In the text, he says, God save thee, my sweet boy. But basically the same line. And then after initially trying to ignore him, this is what King Harry, formerly the good time Prince Hal, has to say. I know thee not, old man. Fall to thy prayers. How ill white hairs become a fool and jester. I have long dreamt of such a kind of man, so surfeit-swelled, so old, and so profane. But being awake, I do despise my dream. Make less thy body hence, and more thy grace. Leave gormandizing, and know the grave doth gape for thee thrice wider than for other men. Reply not to me with fool-born jest. Presume not that I am the thing I was. For God doth know, so shall the world perceive that I have turned away my former self. So will I those that kept me company. When thou dost hear I am as I have been, approach me, and thou shalt be as thou was, the tutor and the feeder of my riots. Till then I banish thee on pain of death, as I have done the rest of my misleaders, not to come near our person by 10 mile. So we can hear a little bit of, we can get a shade of that final piece of dialogue and how Scott concludes his speech in the film. But again, language has been modernized, condensed, but it's the same basic idea. I know thee not, old man. So that whole narrative arc involving Scott, Bob, and his, Bob's merry band of hustlers, and then Scott's eventual transition into being a sort of heir apparent. Again, that's very much akin to Hal, right? Hal is the heir to the throne. Scott is the heir to a family fortune and a certain kind of position in society. So again, it's not royalty, but it's something similar. It's something in that same vein, that idea of being the heir apparent. So all of that just comes directly from Henry IV. That's just Prince Hal and Falstaff. So Van Sant really does adapt some of Shakespeare to go along with his story of street hustlers in Portland that's at least partly based on real stories, autobiographies, real accounts. So I find that mixture of media, that mixture of text, or that mixture of sources to be very interesting in the film. So again, you might want to pay a little bit more attention to that middle section if you're a fan of Shakespeare. If you're not, you might notice that by our third act, you might want to focus a little bit more on the third act of the film, because it really does seem like we've kind of ended up in a slightly different movie. Scott and Mike travel to Italy in that third act, searching for Mike's mom. And we sort of find ourselves in a travelogue, right? We're sort of in pastoral Italy. It's a tale of young love, perhaps, on one hand, and loss on the other, as we start to see Scott maybe transitioning or starting to move closer to his new life, his more respectable life. And of course, we know that any sort of life that he's going to lead in the future will not only probably not include Bob, there's probably not going to be room for Mike either. So he's changing, and Mike is perhaps losing something, losing a friend, losing a connection. So it ends up being sort of a different feel, a different mood, a different style. We have a different setting, by the end of the film, and we have the development of a new relationship for Scott. So, each act of the film, I think, is a little bit different. And gives us some different ideas and maybe even at times different themes to chew on. So a lot of themes kind of that we can identify easily, like unrequited love, young people searching for an identity, searching for a family of some kind, searching for support, security, meaning, a place to call home. The character played by River Phoenix, the Mike character, is often thought of as kind of an innocent or somebody who, perhaps in part based on his narcolepsy, is not always able to totally take care of himself. Some people see him as being a little bit dependent on Scott or on others. So we might think of him as being especially vulnerable. By the end of the film, we might think of Scott as having abandoned him. And we can form our own opinions about that. So like I said, a lot of the attention focused on the film had to do with the cast and the performances of Keanu Reeves as Scotty, River Phoenix as Mikey. And yeah, by the age of 23, I do have it here in my notes, River Phoenix was dead at the age of 23, just 2 years after the release of this film. So obviously, he would have gone on to have a very successful career and would have done a lot of interesting things, no doubt. But also, we should pay a little bit of attention to Robert Richert, who plays Bob. James Russo, who's a pretty well-known character actor. He shows up as Mikey's weirdly, Brooklyn-style brother, sort of slash father. Chiara Caselli plays Carmela. That's Scotty's later love interest. These are all pretty well-known actors, but of course Reeves has gone on to be a star. Reichert was a stage performer, I believe, kind of more of an indie character actor, never really made it big, but was in many films. And Caselli is a well-known Italian actress, and Udo Kier plays the sort of German guy who shows up at various times, tries to pick up Mikey. He's also a well-known European actor. He shows up in a lot of American indies as well. So I was trying to find a little bit more specificity for you guys with the Shakespeare, so I realized now it was on the second page of my notes. So again, if you're interested, you could go to around the 27-minute mark, but for the first 9 minutes or so of that larger sequence, we're mostly getting just Shakespearean style language. When we hear Bob talking to Bud, his sort of assistant, who happens to be played by Flea, the famous bass player for the Red Hot Chili Peppers. He moonlights as an actor at times. So we get some Shakespearean style language from them, but it's not until around the 39-minute mark that we get actual quotes from Henry IV. This is right after the robbery, beginning when Bob shouts, "A plague on all cowards." And then when Scott responds with, "What's up, Bob? Where have you been?" That's like a paraphrase of what Prince Hal says in response in the play. And beginning at that moment, we have a lot of direct quotes and a lot of Shakespearean paraphrases. Just if you want to go back and check that out. So from about the 39-minute mark till right around the time of the police raid where they come and sort of run everybody out of the house, that's really the prime Shakespearean section. And then at the 1 hour, 28-minute mark, that's kind of the beginning of that final moment between Prince Hal and Falstaff where Bob observes Scotty going into the restaurant, follows him in. I love that quote where he says, "Yes, we are drawing attention to ourselves," as he and his buddies, his homeless friends, walk into the restaurant. Everybody's looking at them. He says, "But surely, once Scott sees me, it won't matter the clothes that we're wearing." And he's in for a rude awakening with the response that he gets. So then right at the 1 hour, 30-minute mark, that's where we hear him say, "God save you, my sweet boy." And then Keanu launches into his version of Prince Hal's famous speech. Okay, so that's it for this week. Next week, we will check out Daughters of the Dust. That's our next film, so I'll let you know where that's available. And if you guys want to check in with me, we are nearing the midway point of the semester. We don't have a midterm exam But I do think our second response paper is due soon, and we are hitting that overall halfway mark of the semester. So if you have questions, if you have anything that you're concerned about grade-wise, if you have questions about your first response paper or any of the films, please get in touch. Otherwise, I will see you next week.